This is the fifth Inclusion and Equitable Leadership Circle, and we are talking about the qualities of inclusive leaders today. So the first exercise I want you to do is I want you to think of, and Olivia maybe just gave us her example, the worst job, volunteer or otherwise, that you ever had. And the feelings that you had from that job, like the worst job that you ever had. And what are the adjectives or the feelings that come up to describe that experience? So not the experience itself, but just how you felt in it. So I'll give you about a minute to think of those qualities and words of the worst job that you ever had. And if you'd like to put in the chat the outcomes for you, the experience, the feelings you had, and I can read them out loud from this worst job or experience. So if it's easier for you to unmute and just share or just put them in the chat, what are some feelings or experiences as a result of this bad experience or worst experience? Underappreciated. Oppressed, belittled, undermined, scared, hopeless, outcast. Dysfunctional environment. You felt judged, uncared for, sucked your energy, and gave you ulcers. So repeating, not cared for, not considered, not included, taken advantage of, not appreciated, just a body, kind of used, nobody cared about you, personal values weren't considered or included. I've done this a lot, so I'm going to assume that many of you can relate to some of the things being shared. So the next reflection is what behaviors that were in the organization, this could be formal, informal, but what behaviors resulted in these feelings and outcomes that you had and didn't like? What behaviors? And if you're willing and able to put those behaviors in the chat. I can read them aloud for the recording. Renee, you mentioned dysfunction. Not getting enough sleep, sub meetings. Pack mentality, ruthlessness, write-ups, tattletelling, gossiping, that kind of thing, feeling anxious, being excluded. These would be behaviors on the part of others. Yelling, belittling, one-way communication, no accountability, no action following through if there's a violation. You get the idea. So now we're going to flip it, and I want you to think about a really good experience. It can be a job, a situation, a circumstance, a community you belong to. What was a really good experience? Where you basically felt included and valued, you know? What else did you feel besides included and valued? Like, what were the feelings and the reactions with your body, the outcomes of this experience? Collaborative, thanks, Susan. Sense of community, almost like a family, like interactions. Nick, you missed our discussion on the difference between family and communities, where sometimes family can be sort of weaponized, but we get the essence of what you're saying. There's a sense of togetherness, that everybody matters. Appreciated, hopeful, empowered, sense of purpose, fulfilled. You know, that sounds to me like, you know, you matter, you're seen, you're included. Literally felt love for my coworkers. We would hug at shift changes. That's great, Renee. That was second. And so to follow through on this, what behaviors did the organization, the people, the processes, what behaviors resulted in you feeling this? So asking for inputs, being included, listening and building together, mutual respect, hosting interactions with team and building events, showing appreciation, having collaborative value setting exercises, valuing collaboration, accomplishing things, seeing the difference you made in the world and the help that you encountered. You felt lifted up, you felt seen, you felt supported. You knew that somebody had your back, that if you don't matter, no one has your back. But when someone has your back, that means you matter. And you wanted to be your best. Yeah. It's always interesting when I do this exercise, because across all identities, people have both kinds of experiences. We don't often connect them back to behaviors and think that and follow that sort of flow in terms of trying to understand how you would create an inclusive environment, an equitable environment in your own circle that you would want to do that in. But behaviors are where behaviors create the experience, what I call culture. Whether you feel good, feel valued, it's the behaviors that you're experiencing that are formal or informal. And behaviors trace back to values, conscious or unconscious values of an organization. So we're going to continue to do some little lessons and reflection here. I'm going to share my slides. I'm going to translate this experience, this thinking about the inclusive behaviors that created an inclusive experience and all the other outcomes for you. When we bring in here, always fun doing everything here myself. So let me share this. Slideshow. There we go. Oops, I'm not doing all that. Let's go back up here. When we bring in identities, this is a classic iceberg model, and this is from Jennifer Brown and Being an Inclusive Leader. I know you may not be able to see the icebergs there, but when you guys, some of you know me well enough, but when I do this in person, I will ask people to tell me before I show this slide, what do you see? What is it? What do you know about my identities just from me standing here up in front of you? It's always really interesting what responses I get, but typically they're just going to be things like I'm white, I'm expressing my gender by being female, I'm tall, I don't have an accent, but if I'm in another country, I might have an accent. I might, based on how I'm dressed, I might have an appearance of being a leader or being part of a team if I've got a uniform on. It's all things that are visual and auditory, right? But as you all know, I'm preaching to the choir here, is there's so much underneath the iceberg of who I am. And I want to make very clear that these identities here are part of who you are, but they're not who you are. This is the lens of which our culture and society creates the experiences and see us. I'm using this iceberg model here as how society sees and treats us with these different identities. So because this is a hard to read slide, those identities under the iceberg this is what they are. And we often, it's not uncommon to, think about race and gender and those kinds of things, but there's a lot of information here, right? So I'm going to just give you a minute to just to look at these identities and find them in yourself and notice which ones you relate to and which ones you don't have a story about at all. Again, thinking about the lens of how like some of you maybe have no experience whatsoever being a survivor from trauma, from an accident at all. You might not have any experience with being a veteran or having anybody in your family or that has been a veteran. So just take a minute. I'm going to ask you this question, which is in the next thing here, is what identities do people see you and acknowledge you first for? And my guess is, well, they might be race or culture. They might be some of these, but many of them aren't. So take a minute. How do other people routinely see you? Yeah, thanks for your comment, Janae. The first impressions, the top of the iceberg, are these first impressions that often translate into judgments about everything else about you. Because society and our culture and i.e. behaviors have standards, if you will, inclusive standards, whether you belong or valued or mattered or not, with all of these identities, right? Have you had a chance to look at these enough? Can somebody give me a thumbs up to kind of absorb their continuum and where you might have fit in? What identities here would you like people to acknowledge in a positive way, not a negative way, but would you like them to really know about you? For example, I know I have friends who their passion in life is to be a mother. They love being a mother, but that isn't always recognized or acknowledged. Certainly, if it's acknowledged, it isn't, included in terms of what mothers would need compared to someone who doesn't have kids, for example. So just noting for yourself what identities you would like to be more acknowledged or not to be. Yeah, that's the next question. So I'll give you a minute with that.
Barb, did you want us to write this down or did you want us to just share it?
You can share it. You can write it down yourself.
Okay.
This is kind of, like I said, the reflection part of today is built into the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm an advocate for everybody to have to write inclusion stories. One of the many trainings I do, it's not a long involved training, is helping people identify and write their inclusion story. Several inclusion stories, because the more we can talk about being included, the more we will lead that way, and the more experiences we'll create that are inclusive. Because some of these stories, in many of these, there's a continuum of recognition and award all the way down to shame. So, for example, if we could talk more openly about addictions or being divorced or the fact that half my mom is dying and she's got Alzheimer's and I'm a full-time caregiver for her, or that I have a mental illness runs in my family, and it does, honestly. OCD runs in my family. The more, if I could talk about it more and share it more, and I wasn't shamed or disgraced for it, it'd be a lot easier to create be inclusive leader in inclusive environments that considered it. So it's really robust to think about writing. I always encourage people to have their DEI journal, learning journal that they share. Because the more we can identify our own experiences, like Olivia did today, and share it, it's so powerful.
Right.
So I'll give you, of course, you can go back to this recording, and these are just some different things to think about around these identities that, again, are the way the world sees us. They are part of us, and some of them we would like the world to know more of. And many of them we don't want the world to know of, mostly because we would be excluded. Our safety and survival might be at threat, for example. Thank you for asking.
Of course, of course. I wanted to share something, if you wouldn't mind.
Please.
So kind of reflecting on the question that you asked, um, I will say that for me, I've always been the oddball. So I am just a hodgepodge of eclectic um, things. And I'm also an intersection of many of these things. So for me, I'm not in one box, right? I can't even, as I look at the columns and the rows, I'm like, yeah, I can relate to pretty much most of these. And that's what makes me me. So,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
that's the beauty of it. And that's the beauty of it that I like is that I love living um, I love living, I would say that, but I love living outside of the box to create more intersections and create more rows and columns to fulfill my life.
Beautiful.
Um, yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
just an intersection of them.
Well, and how many relate to what Janae said? How many of you, I relate to, I can find a story in a relationship to almost all of these, either directly or indirectly. And that's the whole point, I think, of this is that we are all very complex, robust human beings. And the whole idea of being an inclusive leader is to be able to show up as that whole complicated, interesting, multifaceted human being that I am. It isn't necessarily about having an environment where I have to express all of these, but I'm not going to be harmed, or I'm not going to be excluded or not promoted or tokenized because I have one of these. So this is the whole idea leading this. The context for this is inclusion, qualities of inclusion, inclusive leaderships. And the fact that you use the word, I almost liked that I put this in a table because the way people perceive us does put us in a box when we're really swimming back here in the waters of all these things. And this is just the tip. This is the, listen to me, the tip of the iceberg, tip underneath the iceberg of what we are and who we are. All of us. You know, many of these categories do not happen. I don't even think there's a single one of these categories that happens, quote unquote, to one race, one individual, one religion, one part of the world kind of a thing. So when I do this exercise with a room full of dominant, for example, the room is the majority of people in the room are elder white men, which I've been working with a lot of groups that way. Not surprising to many of you, this is really an empowering exercise for them to just recognize the awareness of all of the things we are, because many of the generations before us, this whole idea of self-esteem and you're all these things didn't exist. Energy fields, like get out of my space, you're in my, you didn't talk about that in the 50s. Self-esteem wasn't a thing in the 40s and the 50s. Like it wasn't really part of their lived experience to understand and relate and to consider these things in that way. That was the culture. So two other questions to reflect on. We kind of talked about 1 and 2. And some people obviously experience number 2, more misconceptions. Maybe your name is Spanish, but you're not Spanish. There's a lot of misconceptions that can be by that sort of visual, and you may experience that more than other people. How to think about being an inclusive leader? How does your understanding of how your identities that are perceived are affected at your workplace? And you guys have worked through that, but you can take some time and think about that versus other identities. And then, of course, this provides a learning agenda. If you don't have any experience or any exposure to some of those identities, because society does rank and treat them and marginalize them and discriminate them or elevate some of them, it's part of your learning agenda to explore and learn more about your biases towards them or what you don't know about them. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but because you guys know about this, but looking at this, these identities through the power and privilege center, this is just putting those identities on their continuum, and who gets power, who gets rewarded, and exploring then in an exercise of your inclusion, this helps people identify in a safer way or productive way where they might have privilege and power. Everybody has some privilege in the context of how society sees and ranks you and treats you. So being able to identify those and not fall apart because I have some privileges, but be able to leverage those and share those in those communities to be more inclusive is the whole point of this particular teaching point. So we won't go into this, but I'm inviting you. I would like in one of our future sessions to do a more hands-on version of helping you write and find your inclusion story. And it starts with you being aware of areas that you're privileged and areas that you're marginalized. Could you want to tell both stories? Where you're uncomfortable, and exploring that. So I'll just plant that seed. And in terms of being an inclusive leader, all of you work for organizations and volunteer for organizations. I always have to bring this diagram is from Nicole Cordoza and the Anti-Racism Daily in her trainings in her organization, that the work about being an inclusive leader always happens at the individual and interpersonal, the institutional and the structural level. And I like to call out or highlight here that often organizations keep DEI work at the individual and personal level. So we'll teach you about your biases. We'll help you have difficult conversations. But we're really not going to take that any further and actually make any changes to our values and experiences and culture as an organization, in an institution, never mind go even bigger to the larger community and larger systemical institutions. So there's always work to be done as an inclusive leader at all these levels. And then also it's sometimes helpful to realize that individuals change primarily through practice. So that is where trainings and accountability and support groups and being able to have affinity groups and all of these kinds of things help individuals change their practices, upgrade their values, and thus change their behaviors to be more inclusive. But organizations change primarily for the long term and on a larger scale through policy and procedures. But of course, organizations are made up of individuals. So that just helps you sometimes realize where you're focusing your efforts for success in terms of the change model of, you don't want to just stop and scapegoat the individual and interpersonal level. You want to get this to an institutional organizational level, but that often means bringing in the patience and the time to work through policy and procedures and workflows like that. So I just wanted to plant that seed. I have more information on this, but that comes with a larger training, is that basically what we're experiencing, the whole experience that Olivia shared earlier is, and that we all are in, and that you all experienced in your sort of bad example I had you do, is that the default culture is sometimes called the accountability culture, productivity culture. It's based off of mostly values that were cultivated and came from the military, which makes sense since the American USA project, if you will, was that's what colonialism said, or colonialism is. It's a militaristic act. And that bled over into our capitalism and then our work culture. So in an accountability culture, it centers on productivity. The authority is centered on leadership. It's hierarchical, and on controlling and managing and punishing and rewarding folks. We are in a era change right now. I've shared this with you before, where the soil's being tilled. We are moving out of the information age and away from this accountability culture into where relationships and energy is now coming online and being valued and will be the dominant culture. I call that right now being a culture of ownership or value-based. It's what we're trying to create right now by all our work and where we will end up. It absolutely elevates and requires inclusive leadership and authority, and it centers on people. It centers on people without losing productivity. It centers on people. So the authority is shared and owned. And productivity occurs via the values and the culture that's created, the community that's created, not on punishment and reward and control and that sort of thing. You can still have policies. Actually, in an ownership and value-based culture, you need less policies and procedures because people hold each other accountable. Because what they value is people and the relationships. And that is then what fuels the productivity of the effort. So in the current culture we're in, my well-being and the organizations are driven by profits. This is not shocking to anybody here. I'm just naming it. People are just a cog in the wheel, which is why many of you described your worst experience just as that. I like to call out that nonprofits and other strategy like conservation organizations fill the gap in society where the people needs and the environmental needs are not met. It's where the cost of our current culture externalizes real costs onto people and communities and the resource. And so the pattern we get into is we just repeat, we mitigate, we repeat, we mitigate, we repeat, we don't change. I'm working now with Trout Unlimited and some conservation organizations to get them to really be open and transparent that the whole reason they exist is to mitigate a whole value culture system that if was different, they wouldn't need to exist because our relationship with the environment and people would be completely different. Where we're going and what you are all a part of is really more that my well-being, this is the both and. The current culture is either or. But my well-being and the organizations is connected to the well-being of all. The individual and the tribe matter. My well-being of the well-being of the organization is connected to the well-being of all its living parts, the whole. And this is how we get out of the repeat, mitigate, repeat. We actually evolve while still doing the same work that our organization might do. So in terms of power, we move from structural power to referent power. And that is a really fun thing to explore, but at another time. I'm going to skip all of this. Visually, we go from the triangle hierarchical structure to more of a circular inclusive. What I want to spend the last time on in our reflection is the actual qualities of an inclusive leader. So I put this word up here because many organizations have integrity as a value. I personally have integrity as a personal value. But integrity is an outcome. It's an outcome of behaviors. And you could name 2 or 3 yourself right now. Honesty is one of them. My words match my behavior. There are things that I do that have you experience my integrity. I use that as an example because inclusion is the same thing. It's an outcome. And when you act in an inclusive way, you have behaviors that create inclusion, the experience of inclusion for others. And so under that lens, what are the, I want you to think or name or maybe put in the chat, what do you think are signature traits of inclusive leaders? Behaviors that create the experience of inclusion. And I'm showing the chat here in the recording, so just brainstorm. What are signature traits of inclusive leaders? Let's see. Oh, get here. Ask and listen, make changes, open to any and all ideas, putting the team and the individuals up front, calling on individuals who haven't spoken. I'm going to look for 3 more. Dynamic, active listening, lifting up and bringing in the right people to the table, providing multiple methods of communication and access. It's a very robust list. Thank you. Recognizing people, dynamic approaches to make sure all voices are heard. Very good. Sometimes it's helpful to have a little quick, an easy way to kind of package what is an inclusive leader so you can measure yourself against it and actually help cultivate. So here is my compilation of some of the credible sources out there of this 7 C's. You know, it helps to have an acronym, traits of inclusive leaders. Commitment, consistency, courage, cognizant, curiosity, cultural intelligence, and collaboration that create an experience of my well-being is connected to the well-being of all. And the well-being of the organization is connected to the well-being of all its living parts. So let's look at each of these a little further. And what I invite you to do, if you'd like to, as you're listening or want to do this, is rate yourself on a scale from 1 to 10 as we explore these, on where you would like to be, where you think you are and where you'd like to be. And this is a personal thing. It's not meant to be shaming or anything. It's like, because it would help you. You could then focus in on, I'd like to focus on being more cognizant in my inclusive leadership learning agenda and growth. Use it as a tool, not as a judgment. If you want, you can sort of rate yourself. That's kind of the exercise. So what is commitment? And these are words and language of the organizations that use it. So commitment means you're visible about being inclusive. You're transparent. You articulate an authentic commitment to things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. You're committed to challenging the status quo, whether that's interpersonally, organizationally. You have ways to hold yourself and others accountable. And you somewhere elevated DEI a commitment in your personal life for whatever reasons. So there's a commitment to being inclusive. It's alive in you. Consistency. Consistency, what falls under there is having and continuing to grow in your emotional intelligence, in your relationship intelligence. So the ability to have challenging conversations, the ability to call in, call out. You know, you're consistent in your behaviors around inclusion. You navigate resistance because it's countercultural. You are going to come across resistance. So you don't shut down, go away, give up. You navigate it. You cultivate a both and perspective, which we had a whole session on that. You keep your inclusion as a vision, a presence, your attention is around it, your intention is around it. You're consistently living and vibrating inclusion in so many different ways as part of your core. I'll give you a minute to reflect on that. So courage, this can be at a personal or organizational level as well. There needs to be a bit of humility and humbleness to be able to make mistakes, to acknowledge your own biases. We all have biases. I'm not a bad person because I have biases. I'm an effective inclusive leader when I lean into those biases and I learn about them and I'm willing to make mistakes. I'm modest about my capabilities. I don't try to be everything to everybody. I try to stay in my lane that allows more other people, other voices, other stories, other life experiences to be on the table and in the room. I create spaces for others to contribute. I don't just hope they happen. I know when to speak out, but I also know when to be quiet and let others have some space. I have the courage to have these challenging conversations, bring them up, lean into them, to ask, to listen. So courage is a big one. So give yourself a chance to rate yourself there. We'll go on to the category of cognizant. I'm careful I say it correctly. So this is your cognizant, you're aware of your personal blind spots. You're aware of and seek out to find constructively flaws in the system. And you work effectively to measure, you work effectively to ensure a meritocracy. You evolve your own inclusion story and your own equity statement. Equity statement is another thing I encourage people to write, a personal equity statement and to share it. Again, I'm big about getting your voice, out there, your story out there. So you're cognizant. There's overlap with all of these, of course. Curiosity, you're curious about your own biases, your own story, your own lived experiences and their biases. You're curious and you demonstrate an open mindset and but curiosity about others' lived experiences, their identities, the way they are perceived and treated in your organization, in society. You're able to listen, without judgment or without having to correct or, say your own or change somebody's mind. You're able, this is emotional intelligence, but to seek empathy and understand others' lived experiences. So you realize and value the complexity of others and the complexity of the value of that complexity in serving the whole, because you benefit. So cultural intelligence, sometimes this can be interpreted as I'm aware of the Asian culture, of the Hispanic culture. It means that that is helpful, but it's really more about the organization culture. Having this, it's both and, so I'll just say that, and I need to express this correctly, or the way I want to express it here. It's the cultural experiences that people are having in our current culture. So our culture is that accountability, of that productivity, the hierarchy, patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism creates an experience for certain identities. And we explored the narratives that either elevate those in power or keep those marginalized and oppressed people marginalized and oppressed, and the rest of the people asleep. So it's understanding that kind of culture is what this is really about, and learning about, God, this is what it's like for you to be in this particular culture, to have this identity. I want to learn more about that intelligence so that I can adapt and be aware and be a voice and an advocate and an ally, cognizant, and be a change agent and an inclusive leader. So both and on culture there. And then finally, collaboration. We're not going to do this alone. If we spend all our resources just teaching implicit bias, for example, and checking our own biases, we will not get anywhere in terms of actually moving forward into the new era where relationships and people are centered and valued. So we have to collaborate. We have to do things together. And we want to empower those around us to work with, learn with, make mistakes with, enter with, educate. And sometimes that might mean leaving and using your resources and resting and taking care of yourself and using them where they're valued, like Olivia shared earlier. How can we collaborate to create psychological safety and belonging and change the values and experiences in our own organization? So we're not going to do this alone. So those of you listening on the recording, or those that you want to come back to this, in your inclusion story, you can be always come back to where am I? Where's my learning edge? Where's my learning agenda? How am I doing on how I want to be in these areas of being an inclusive leader? I'm going to stop sharing and give you guys a second to just absorb that material, come back to seeing you. Stop sharing. There we go. Stop the recording. Thank you.